The candles flickered softly across the cake, 58 of them, lined in a perfect circle like the years themselves, glowing and quiet. Each flame marked another season of sound and silence, of songs written and storms survived. Yet the room felt incomplete. There was no laughter echoing down the hallway, no voice teasing him to make a wish, no whisper of "Happy birthday, baby." For the first time in 19 years, her absence wasn't a rumor or rehearsal. It was real. There was no Nicole. Her name had been the echo that followed him through every song, the ghost at the edge of every stage light. Nicole Kidman, the muse who once stood beside him through chaos and Carmelite, who had been his mirror and his melody. Together, they had once seemed untouchable, two souls who had built a home out of heartbreak and turned their private wounds into public art. Now, as Keith Urban stared at the quiet cake before him, the silence carried its own kind of music, the sound of a door closing for the final time. To the press, it was a graceful separation. To the tabloids, a tragedy long foretold. But to the man who made a living out of turning pain into poetry, it was simpler. It wasn't heartbreak or betrayal, just an ending, inevitable and unspoken. He looked at the candles, almost expecting her hand to appear again, steadying the wax before it melted, as she always used to. But it didn't. The candles burned, their wax trailing like the years between them, and outside, Nashville kept moving. Fans still streamed his songs. Radio stations still played his hits. To the world, Keith Urban was fine. Still the golden boy of country music, the man too kind to crumble, too strong to break. But the truth was quieter. Keith Urban had stopped celebrating long before this birthday. Every song he had performed in the months leading up to it carried the sound of farewell, not to a woman, but to a life. He sang of freedom, but his chords trembled. He smiled for cameras, but his eyes were tired, the kind of tired that comes from holding together something that had already fallen apart. Stop reading into it, he told his fans on stage one night, after changing a line in You'll Think of Me. But how could they not? How could anyone not search for meaning in the songs of a man whose heartbeat was melody itself? Keith Urban. The name once meant resurrection. Proof that love could heal what addiction had broken, that faith could rebuild what fame had stripped away. Together with Nicole, he had become a symbol of survival, the recovering addict turned devoted husband, the actress who had been broken by Hollywood and rebuilt by hope. They were two wounded angels who learned how to fly together, until one day, they couldn't. On September 30th, 2025, Nicole Kidman walked into a Tennessee courthouse and signed her name beneath the words "Irreconcilable Differences." 3 weeks later, Keith stood alone before thousands, singing the same songs they used to hum in their kitchen, the melodies that once filled the silence between them. When the final chord faded, he didn't bow. He simply whispered, "Thank you," and walked off stage. The crowd erupted, unaware that the applause sounded to him like goodbye. He smiled for the cameras, as he always did, but behind that smile lived a truth no lyric could disguise, that even the most beautiful songs must one day end. And so began a new one, not a love song, but a requiem for one, the story of a man learning to play alone again. Long before the stadiums and the headlines, there was a small boy listening to the world through thin walls. Keith Lionel Urban was born in Whangarei, New Zealand, under a sky that always felt too wide for the tiny homes his family could afford. When he was still young, they crossed the Tasman Sea to Caboolture, a working-class town north of Brisbane. The afternoon smelled of rain and cut grass, the roads of hot tar and dust. His father sold signs. His mother worked the counter at the corner store. They lived small, but the dreams were loud, carried on vinyl records that filled their modest home with the voices of Johnny Cash, Don Williams, and Waylon Jennings. The boy listened. He listened to everything, to the rhythm of trucks passing, to his parents' sighs behind closed doors, to the soft crackle of vinyl turning grief into gospel. When he was 6, his father placed a guitar in his hands. The strings were high, his fingers were small. It hurt. He pressed down anyway, until the pain turned into something else. A signal, a map. Every callus became a secret doorway. He learned that pain had coordinates, and if you followed them long enough, they led to music. School didn't understand him. He wasn't the loud one, or the fighter, or the hero on the field. He was a quiet boy, counting beats between the clock's ticks, translating silence into song. The other kids played games. Keith played chords. He learned early that the world rarely listens, so he taught himself to speak through melody. That small boy, sitting cross-legged on a linoleum floor, pressing his fingers against steel strings until they bled, could not have imagined that one day the same hands would sign autographs, hold Grammys, or tremble over a birthday cake without the woman who once believed in him more than he believed in himself. But maybe that's what every artist learns, sooner or later, that love, like music, is never truly lost. It just changes key. Long before the world knew his name, Keith Urban had already been through the kind of storms that strip a man down to his truth. His voice, that velvet rasa could make a crowd of thousands go silent, was born not out of fame, but out of fracture. In Australia's small-town bars, he was just another kid with a guitar, trying to play his way out of the noise in his head. Nights blurred into mornings, and applause blurred into addiction. The music came easy. It was life that didn't. He once said in an interview, "Music was my medicine, but it was also my disease." There was a time when his songs saved him just as often as they destroyed him. He was the life of the party, the last one to leave, the one who made everyone laugh, until they weren't laughing anymore. Fame had come like a spotlight too bright to stand under for long. The boy who dreamed of Nashville suddenly found himself living inside the machine, one hit single after another, one bottle after another, one apology too many. The press called it a battle with demons, but that made it sound poetic. In truth, it was ugly. There were relapses, there were rehabs, and there were nights so long he forgot where the dawn was supposed to be. He hid behind his guitar, behind that disarming smile that convinced people he was fine. But he wasn't fine. He was drowning, quietly, beautifully, invisibly. The world saw a man on stage. Nicole Kidman saw the man beneath it. When they met in 2005, she wasn't a Hollywood goddess and he wasn't a country star. They were just two souls carrying different kinds of loneliness. She had walked through her own kind of hell, divorce, loss, the endless scrutiny of fame, and still carried the softness of someone who refused to grow bitter. He was a man who made her laugh again, who sang not to impress but to understand. And maybe that's why they fit, because both had lived enough lives to know that love isn't built in the sunlight, but in the shadows you choose to share. But loving Keith Urban meant walking through fire, and Nicole did, again and again. When he checked himself into rehab just months after their wedding, she didn't leave. She flew to him. She sat beside him in silence, not as a movie star, but as a woman who believed that love could outlast chaos. "She saved my life," he would later say, not as a confession, but as a vow. Recovery wasn't a clean line. It was jagged, filled with temptation, triumph, and shame. There were nights when he'd sit alone with a guitar, staring at the glass on the table like it was both the enemy and the cure. He learned to replace the craving for numbness with the craving for truth. Every time he played, he poured out what he used to drown. Every concert became a confession. Every lyric, a step closer to redemption. And through it all, Nicole stood like quiet light, never demanding perfection, only presence. Their home in Nashville became a sanctuary where fame was left at the door. They raised their daughters in laughter and lullabies, far from the noise of cameras. For a time, it seemed the storm had passed. Keith's music soared again. Blue Ain't Your Color, The Fighter, Parallel Line. Each song a love letter to the woman who had given him another chance at life. His career hit its highest point, but his heart stayed humble. He'd say on stage, "I'm just a kid from Caboolture who got lucky," but luck had nothing to do with it. He had fought for every breath of peace he'd earned. But peace is fragile, especially for people who have known chaos too long. Over the years, the marriage became less of a duet and more of a dance with distance. Fame took them to different places, different time zones, different silences. Nicole's world was film sets and scripts. His was stages and sound checks. They still loved each other, maybe too much, maybe not enough. Sometimes love doesn't die. It just stops knowing how to speak. Behind the smiles and red carpets, small fractures began to form. Missed calls, unsent messages, words swallowed instead of spoken. The very thing that once bonded them, understanding, began to fade. They tried, of course. There were vacations, family trips, long walks meant to remind them of who they were. But even the gentlest love can wear thin under the weight of years lived in public. Keith's music began to change again. The chords grew slower, the lyrics more intimate, more painful. Love is not about forever, he sang once. It's about who you become because of it. Fans thought it was poetic. They didn't realize it was prophecy. The man who once wrote about being saved was now writing about letting go. By 2025, their story had stopped being a marriage and become a memory, one held with tenderness, not regret. Nicole remained the woman who had seen him through the worst, who had taught him that real love isn't about fixing, but witnessing. And Keith, in his quiet resilience, had become proof that even the broken can become beautiful again. Addiction no longer defined him. It refined him. Every scar became a lyric. Every relapse became a reminder. He no longer ran from pain. He played it. And somewhere in the echo of his songs, you can still hear her, not as a loss, but as a note that never fades. Because that's what love does when it's real. It doesn't vanish. It transforms into melody, into memory, into the quiet kind of grace that lingers long after the music ends. By the time Keith Urban turned 57, the applause no longer thrilled him the way it once did. He still smiled on stage, still thanked the fans, still played with the same fierce precision. But inside, something quieter had begun to take over. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It was surrender. The kind that comes after years of fighting to keep something alive that no longer breathes. The newspapers called it a silent split, as if silence were an absence. But Keith knew better. Silence, to him, had always been another kind of sound, the place where truth finally speaks. 4 months before the separation, he and Nicole had been seen together, still holding hands, still smiling at premieres. To the public eye, they looked unbreakable. But behind the polished photos were pauses, those small, aching spaces between two people who no longer knew how to reach each other. They had stopped arguing long ago. The opposite of love isn't hate, he once said. It's indifference. They weren't indifferent, but they had become careful. Too careful. Every conversation measured, every silence padded. Love, when it becomes that polite, begins to die in whispers. And so they drifted, not out of anger, but out of mercy. There was no betrayal, no villain, no final fight that broke them. Just a soft unraveling. They had given each other everything, and now, perhaps, the kindest thing left to give was release. You can love someone, Nicole had once said, and still know you're meant to walk a different way. After the papers were signed, Keith didn't vanish into the spotlight the way most do. He withdrew from it. He started spending long hours in his studio, not recording, just playing. No microphones, no producers, no audience. Music. Stripped back to what it was before fame. A conversation with himself. Some days he'd sit for hours with his guitar resting on his knee, fingers barely moving, listening to the hum of the strings as if waiting for them to answer back. The press speculated endlessly. Was he writing a breakup album? Planning a comeback? But the truth was quieter. Keith wasn't chasing a record, he was chasing meaning. When you've lived half your life through headlines, there comes a time when you crave something unphotographed. For him, that was silence. He'd go driving through the Tennessee backroads late at night, windows down, no music playing. He'd park by the river where he and Nicole used to walk and just sit there, watching the reflection of streetlights ripple across the dark water. The city slept. The world moved on. But in that stillness, Keith felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He once said in a radio interview, peace isn't the absence of noise, it's learning not to need it. Maybe that was what this chapter was about. Not loss, not loneliness, but learning to live without the echo of applause. For so long, his worth had been measured by sound, the roar of crowds, the hum of approval, the music that defined him. But now, in the quiet, he was rediscovering the man beneath the melody. People around him noticed a change. He laughed more, but softer. His eyes no longer searched the room. They rested. He started painting again, something he hadn't done since his 20s. Small, abstract pieces, mostly shades of blue and gold. They are not about sadness, he told a friend. They are about remembering. He began gardening, too, something simple, grounding, tending to life that didn't demand to be seen. And yet, music never left him. It couldn't. It was woven into his bones. But what changed was his reason for creating it. The next album he recorded, privately at first, had no label, No deadline, no radio hooks. Just songs, slow, stripped, raw. A man, a guitar, a story. One of the tracks, tentatively titled Mercy Road, opened with a single line that said everything. We loved each other enough to let go. It wasn't a sad album. It was honest. A quiet celebration of endings that don't destroy you, but redefine you. Of love that doesn't fade, but transforms. Of forgiveness, not of the other, but of oneself. When Nicole heard it, she called him. Not to discuss the past, not to reopen anything, but simply to say, it's beautiful. That was enough. No grand closure, no interview statements. Just two people who had once shared a life acknowledging what it had been. Sacred, imperfect, real. The world will always hunger for scandal, but Keith and Nicole gave them something rarer, dignity. There were no accusations, no bitterness, no rewritten history, just gratitude. Because at their core, they had both understood something most never do, that sometimes the purest form of love isn't possession, it's release. And that became the quiet truth of Keith Urban's life after love. He didn't drown in heartbreak. He grew from it. He turned the wreckage into rhythm, the silence into sound. His music shifted from stadium anthems to intimate hymns, not for the world, but for the soul. When he sang Now, it wasn't to prove anything. It was to remember. He often said he didn't believe in endings anymore. Every story, he told a journalist once, just changes shape. Maybe that's what love had done, changed shape. It had stopped being a shared life and become a shared legacy. Nicole moved forward with her films, Keith with his music, but somewhere between their paths, the memory of what they'd built still stood, untarnished, unbroken, untouched by time. Because not all love stories are meant to last forever. Some are meant to teach us how to begin again. There's a peculiar quiet that follows after a life lived in headlines, a kind of silence that feels heavier than applause. For Keith Urban, that silence became both his teacher and his test. At 58, he was no longer chasing what the world once called success. The Grammys gleamed on the shelves, the tours had all been sold out, and the legacy that was already carved into the fabric of country music. But when the noise faded, what remained was simpler, purer, a man and his truth. He had always believed music was his purpose, but now he began to see it differently. Music wasn't the destination, it was a mirror. Every note reflected a part of him he had once tried to hide. The anger, the guilt, the tenderness, the forgiveness. Each song was no longer about survival or fame, but about stillness, about learning to exist in the space between the sound. On an ordinary evening in Nashville, long after the crowd had gone home, Keith sat in his studio with only the dim hum of the amplifier and the faint scent of rain drifting through the window. His guitar rested against his leg, his fingers moving with the calm ease of someone who had finally stopped running. The melody he played was slow, almost like breathing. He wasn't writing for anyone, not for a record, not for the charts, not even for himself. It was for her, for the woman who had once saved him, loved him, and then, with grace, let him go. Love doesn't end, he murmured once during a rare podcast interview. It just changes what it's here to do. Maybe that was what time had taught him, that not all love stories were tragedies. Some simply evolve into peace. Nicole Kidman, for her part, had found her own rhythm in the stillness. She spoke little of the past, and when she did it with kindness. In an interview with Vogue Australia, she said, "Some things deserve silence more than explanation." The world wanted heartbreak headlines, but she offered something far rarer, dignity. She wasn't bitter, just grateful. For her, that love had been a chapter written in gold ink, brief, shining, unforgettable. They didn't erase each other. They didn't pretend it hadn't mattered. They simply understood that some stories are complete even without a perfect ending. Keith once told a friend that he still keeps a small photo of Nicole in the studio, not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of mercy, because that's what their love had become in its final form. Mercy, the gentle, quiet kind that asks for nothing in return. In the months after their parting, Keith began performing again. Smaller venues this time, stripped-down acoustic sets where the stage lights felt like candlelight instead of spotlights. He'd talk to the audience between songs, not as a star, but as a man who had lived. The songs weren't about fame or heartbreak anymore. They were about truth and how it feels to keep walking even when the song ends. One night in Austin, after finishing a haunting version of Somebody Like You, he paused and looked at the crowd. "I used to think love was about forever," he said softly. "Now I think it's about freedom." The audience went silent. Not a single camera flash. Just stillness, the kind that only appears when everyone in the room recognizes themselves in someone else's truth. The new album he released months later was unlike anything he'd done before. Critics called it spiritual, existential, achingly human. He called it light between the wreckage. It wasn't a comeback, it was a confession. Every lyric dripped with a kind of honesty that comes only after you've lost everything you once thought you needed. In one of the songs, After the Silence, he sang, "You can't save the people you love, but you can love them enough to let them go." Those who knew his story understood. Those who didn't simply felt it. And somewhere in that quiet music, the old wounds began to close. Slowly, softly, like dawn returning after a long night. He smiled more these days, not the dazzling smile of a star, but the humble one of a man who has finally made peace with his past. The man who once chased redemption and applause had found it instead in acceptance. When asked what he'd learned from everything, the fame, the fall, the love, the loss, he paused for a long time and said, "That love isn't meant to save us. It's meant to shape us." And perhaps that's a secret truth behind all great stories, that even heartbreak has a purpose. It humbles us. It softens us. It turns us into something capable of seeing beauty in impermanence. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban may no longer share a home, but they will always share a history, one built on faith, forgiveness, and the kind of tenderness that time can't tarnish. In their own ways, they both walked away whole. She, carrying grace. He, carrying song. And somewhere between them still lives the echo of what they once were, not broken, not lost, but beautifully unfinished. Because real love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means walking away with your head high, your heart open, and your soul still singing. And in that final silence, Keith Urban found not loneliness, but something deeper, peace.